Tonight, it's Nafta 2.0. President Trump praising his new deal with Canada and Mexico, announced just an hour before a midnight deadline. Its official name, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement.
This landmark agreement will send cash and jobs pouring into the United States.
Most of the deal doesn't take effect until 2020. For the president, it's a campaign promise kept.
And I promised to renegotiate Nafta, and today we have kept that promise.
Dairy farmers could be among the biggest winners, with Canada agreeing to open their market to more American producers.
There's much that needs to be done in terms of some of our other trading partners. So we're on the right path. We're encouraged by that, but by no means is our work done.
But the downside, the agreement could cause car prices to rise because it demands higher labor costs and a larger percentage of car parts have to be made in all three countries. Union workers are cautiously optimistic, hoping the move will prevent jobs from going overseas. Also smiling, everyone with a 401k. The stock market rallied more than 200 points on the news.
It will not bring back manufacturing jobs from Mexico, and it will not affect our trade balance with Mexico, but it is a large number of small updates.
I want to make sure that we elect
one major hurdle, Congress still has to approve the deal, and you can bet President Trump will use that to energize Republican voters here in Tennessee with just weeks until the midterms.
It's my great honor to announce that we have successfully completed negotiations on a brand new deal to terminate and replace Nafta and the Nafta trade agreements with an incredible new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement called USMCA. It sort of just works. MCA. USMCA. And that'll be the name, I guess, that 99% of the time we'll be hearing, USMCA. Has a good ring to it. I have long contended that Nafta was perhaps the worst trade deal ever made. Since NAFTA's adoption, the United States racked up trade deficits totaling more than $2 trillion, and it's a much higher number than that. With Canada and Mexico, it lost vast amounts of money and lost 4.1 million manufacturing jobs and 1 in 4 auto jobs. Lost about 25% of our auto jobs, even more than that. Throughout the campaign, I promised to renegotiate NAFTA, and today we have kept that promise. But for 25 years as a civilian, as a businessman, I used to say, how could anybody have signed a deal like NAFTA? And I watched New England and so many other places where I was, just the factories were leaving, the jobs were leaving, people were being fired. And we can't have that. So we have negotiated this new agreement based on the principle of fairness and reciprocity. To me, it's the most important word in trade because we've been treated so unfairly by so many nations all over the world, and we're changing that. We just signed a much better deal with South Korea. We had a horrible, horrible deal, and we just signed that at United Nations, and that's worked out well, and they're happy, we're happy. Good for jobs, good for a lot of things. When that deal was signed, they said 250,000 jobs will be given by signing this transaction. And they were right. I've said it before. They were right. 250,000 jobs to South Korea, not to the United States. So that's changed, and very much for the better. And this one is a brand new deal. The agreement will govern nearly $1.2 trillion in trade, which makes it the biggest trade deal in the United States history. I want to congratulate U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer, who has worked. Nobody understands how hard he's worked. No matter when you called him, he was in the office, or he was in somebody else's office doing the same thing. Bob Lighthizer is great. I've heard it for years. I said, if I ever do this, I want to get Lighthizer to represent us, because he felt the way I did. And the entire team at the USTR standing behind me, and some right here in the audience. I want to thank you all. Fantastic job. Peter Navarro, everybody. Thank you all. Thank you. Fantastic group of people. They love our country. I also want to thank Secretary Mnuchin, Secretary Ross, Secretary Nielsen, Secretary Perdue, Jared Kushner, Peter Navarro, and the United States Ambassador to Canada, Kelly Craft. Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you very much. I also want to thank President Peña Nieto of Mexico, who we had a few disagreements, but I really like him a lot. I think he may like me, I'm not sure. But I think he's a terrific person, and he'll be leaving soon, but he's really done a good job and wonderful, wonderful person. And the Mexican president-elect, Lopez Obrador, who has given his support to this agreement, and we're developing a really good relationship, which I think is very important for our country, frankly, and for Mexico. And so they worked together on this. This was done by both. I said, look, I don't want to sign an agreement, and then a new president comes in. They don't like it, and we have difficulty. They worked very much together on it, and I appreciate it from both. I have to certainly give my highest regards to Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. A lot of stories came out about Justin and I having difficulty together, and we did over the trade deal. But I'll tell you, it's turned out to be a very, very good deal for both, and a very, very good deal for all three. It puts us in a position that we've never been in before. It's very good when you look at the world and what the world is doing, and when you look at the unfair trade practices that countries are using against the United States. This is a terrific deal for all of us. Once approved by Congress, this new deal will be the most modern, up-to-date, and balanced trade agreement in the history of our country, with the most advanced protections for workers ever developed. If you look at the reviews, people that would normally not under any circumstances say good things, because automatically they have to say bad. Even some Democrats say that's amazing. We had some, they haven't been given the sound bites yet, I guess, Mike. But actually you had some Democrats say this is really amazing if he really got all of that. But by tomorrow I would suspect they'll change their tune. But that's okay, because people know how good it is. It's an amazing deal for a lot of people. Likewise, it will be the most advanced trade deal in the world, with ambitious provisions on the digital economy, patents, very important, financial services, and other areas where the United States has a strong competitive advantage. Mexico and Canada have agreed to strong new labor protections, environmental protections, and new protections for intellectual property. So important. This new deal is an especially great victory for our farmers. Our farmers have gone through a lot over the last 15 years. They've been taken advantage of by everybody. Prices have gone way down. And we're working on some other deals that are going to make them very happy also. But this is a very, very big deal for our farmers. Mexico and Canada will be opened up a lot more than they are now. And I think there'll be a better spirit between the three countries, which is important for our farmers. The agreement will give our farmers and ranchers far greater access to sell American-grown produce in Mexico and in Canada. The deal includes a substantial increase in our farmers' opportunities to export American wheat, poultry, eggs, and dairy, including milk, butter, cheese, yogurt, and ice cream, to name a few. I want to be very specific.
As we continue, scrap NAFTA, Senator Obama, or fix it?
I would immediately call the President of Mexico, the President of Canada, to try to amend NAFTA, because I think that we can get labor agreements in that agreement right now. And it should reflect the basic principle that our trade agreements should not just be good for Wall Street, it should also be good for Main Street.
It is not enough just to criticize NAFTA, which I have, and for some years now. I have put forth a very specific plan about what I would do. And it does include telling Canada and Mexico that we will opt out unless we renegotiate the core labor and environmental standards.
Well, there's no doubt that NAFTA needs to be amended. And I've already said that I would contact the President of Mexico and the Prime Minister of Canada to make sure that the labor and environmental agreements are actually enforceable in the same way that patent protections and other things that are important to corporate America are enforceable.
It is absolutely true that NAFTA was a mistake. It is absolutely critical for us to understand that NAFTA was an enormous problem. The permanent trade relations with China, without some of the enforcement mechanisms that were in there, that you voted for, was also a significant problem.
They said, please, would you, rather than terminating NAFTA, I was all set to do it. In fact, I was going to do it today. I was going to do it as we're sitting here. I would have had to delay you. I was going to do it today. I was going to terminate NAFTA. But they called up and they said, would you negotiate? And I said, yes, I will negotiate. It's my great honor to announce that we have successfully completed negotiations on a brand new deal to terminate and replace NAFTA and the NAFTA trade agreements with an incredible new U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement called USMCA. It sort of just works, MCA. It's my great honor to announce that we have successfully completed negotiations on a brand new deal to terminate and replace NAFTA and the NAFTA trade agreements with an incredible new U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement called USMCA. It sort of just works, MCA. USMCA. And that'll be the name, I guess, that 99% of the time we'll be hearing, USMCA. Has a good ring to it. I have long contended that NAFTA was perhaps the worst trade deal ever made. Since NAFTA's adoption, the United States racked up trade deficits totaling more than $2 trillion, and it's a much higher number than that. With Canada and Mexico, it lost vast amounts of money and lost 4.1 million manufacturing jobs and 1 in 4 auto jobs. Lost about 25% of our auto jobs, even more than that. Throughout the campaign, I promised to renegotiate NAFTA, and today we have kept that promise. But for 25 years as a civilian, as a businessman, I used to say, how could anybody have signed a deal like NAFTA? And I watched New England and so many other places where I was, just the factories were leaving, the jobs were leaving, people were being fired, and we can't have that. So we have negotiated this new agreement based on the principle of fairness and reciprocity. To me, it's the most important word in trade, because we've been treated so unfairly by so many nations all over the world, and we're changing that.
Off the rails. But finally, last night, Canada, the U.S., and Mexico reached a tentative trade deal, an agreement in principle. The Prime Minister has long said no deal is better than a bad deal. So is this better than no deal? That's a tongue twister. Joining me now is Laura Dawson, Director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Centre, and Mary Scott Greenwood, a former U.S. diplomat to Canada, now a principal at Denton's. What questions do you have for everyone watching? We want to hear from you. You can send us your questions on Facebook, on Twitter, or on YouTube, and I will take them as they come in. I'll start off with a couple selfishly of my own. Laura, I'll start with you. Nice to see you here in Ottawa. Tariffs. We just spoke with Jim Wilson, Minister Jim Wilson from the Ontario government, and his takeaway was they should not have left those 232 steel and aluminum tariffs floating up in the air, hanging in the balance, and sign this deal, or at least they should have held out for more. What do you think?
I can see that point. I was really divided on it as well, but it's the difference between the deal you could get and an optimum deal. They had a really narrow window to finish this deal off. The president, was ready to pull the plug. There was a very narrow window of opportunity. And so what they did was they left the 232 possibility on the table, certainly the steel and aluminum, but Canada just decided it wasn't the hill it was going to die on. There's all sorts of other allies in the world, European Union, Congress, business community, who also are opposed to these tariffs. So I think Canada's just took the deal they could get, and they're going to wait till they get more bench strength to push against the 232s.
Scotty, I found the president's comments on these tariffs so interesting today. I think he called people who were complaining about them babies, and he included members of Congress in that. But essentially, he made the point that, yes, I did use these as leverage, and it worked, was what he said. Does he have a point?
Well, the weird thing about it, Vashi, is that he said, I use them as leverage, and it worked, and we're getting deals, and yet then you would think that if you got to deal with Canada, then therefore you should take them down. You should take down these 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. They're doing real damage already to the U.S. economy, not to mention Canada, Mexico. And so he's kind of all over the place on this. What the White House, I talked to the White House about it after the press conference, and what the White House and PMO are saying is it's on a separate track. All I can hope is that that's a fast track, that we get to some sort of a resolution of these tariffs, because they also come with retaliation. So we really need to get that part done as soon as possible. It is a good day, and I'm glad that the perfect wasn't the enemy of the good. I agree with Laura on that. But I do think it's enormously important that we get these tariffs dealt with, because remember the premise, the president says he's using them for leverage, but then what the rest of his government says is, oh no, it's a national security complaint that we have with Canada, which is even more insulting and on its face not even sustainable as an argument. Of course, Canada and the United States are connected security partners. So anyway, the U.S. is all over the place on this, and we really need to fix it.
Yeah, the 232s are actually written into the auto deal. In order to enforce that auto deal, they need to continue to use that national security tariff. So I don't buy the argument that they're transient and fleeting. I think they've got to be rooted out of there.
Can I ask you both really quickly about next steps? And I found it interesting that the Prime Minister today said, you know, yes, we're sort of reveling in the fact that there's an agreement in principle, but we haven't totally crossed the finish line next. Are there substantive hurdles to this agreement actually coming into effect? Laura,
Sure.
I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, finishing off these negotiations, they first of all had to make sure that anything that Mexico had left undone was done. Not that Mexico didn't do a really good job, but they did it very quickly. So they had to make sure that they had a deal that was satisfactory to the trilateral arrangement. Then the Canadians had to make sure it was satisfactory to enough of their stakeholders, keeping in mind that there were going to be some provinces and some sectors that were kind of ticked off. And then they had to figure out a deal that was appropriate, that would be acceptable by both Republicans in Congress and Democrats in Congress. So I'll let Scotty talk more about the political dynamics there in the U.S.
Okay, quickly, I'll get you to weigh in, Scotty. And a reminder to everyone on Facebook and Twitter, send in your questions. We're about to start using them. So I'll just finish up with Scotty on that point.
Sure. Well, the major undone piece in the United States, of course, is ratification by Congress. All three countries have their own process to go through. And by the time this gets to the U.S. Congress, there's likely to be a different Congress and potentially a different party in control. So a question is whether a Democratic House would be willing to ratify a Trump trade deal that he's claiming so much credit for. So it was difficult. Laura remembers, as I do, and you may too, Vashi, back in the day when we had the first ratification of NAFTA with President Clinton and Speaker Newt Gingrich, two opposite parties, getting it across the goal line. And it was a fight. It was a close vote. People lost their seats over it. My friend Buddy Darden, Congressman of Georgia, voted the right way, the free trade way, for NAFTA originally, and then he was defeated in the subsequent election. So it's really high stakes politics, and it's certainly not over yet.
Okay, let me take a question from Evan on Twitter. Laura, how does the USMCA rank for Canada in between the best and worst possible agreements? How would you rate it?
On a defensive level, it ranks as one of the strongest agreements because, look, 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. You can't do without the NAFTA. And so they got a great balance between holding the line on defensive interests and getting some new elements. Now, frankly, the Canada-EU agreement and the Trans-Pacific Partnership both have lots of bells and whistles, very progressive, very digging down deeper into trade and economic objectives. But our trade, Canada's trade with those two regions is so relatively minimal that they had to get something, they had to get the USMCA right with North America. So that is really the top priority in terms of importance, even though it's not the most forward-leaning deal that could have been done.
Okay, and Scotty, Jason Dass on Facebook asked, does this new deal address anything in terms of workers looking to apply for visas or TN visas and create more jobs for USMCA exemptions?
I totally wish it did, and my reading is that it didn't, although I haven't finished combing through it, but I don't think it deals with labor mobility at all. And that's another area of unfinished work that we really need to look at because we are still stuck in a couple decades old classification of how people get visas and how they move back and forth across the border, and we need to update it. I don't think this deal does that.
Yeah, what we've heard from the reading of the Mexican text and media is that the TN visa situation stays status quo, but there's no upgrading in new professions and new recognition of higher skilled labor.
Okay, Jackie Powers asks something that I think a lot of dairy farmers and others are wondering on the concessions. Any dollar value on the cost to dairy farmers out of this? Anything that can quantify it above and beyond, X percentage of the market allotted?
Great question. I'm going to pass on that.
Hard.
Maybe Scotty wants to take that. But let's keep in mind the potential benefits for consumers, and also that eventually, slowly, Canada's dairy market is becoming more competitive for new entrants to the market, new products, and ultimately that's a good thing.
Scotty, how is the dairy was such a huge part of the rhetoric in the entire lead up until today. How is it being perceived there, or is this as much a win for the president as he indicated it was during his press conference today?
Well, the president does use a little bit of hyperbole from time to time, as we know. Is this a great deal or the greatest deal of all time, right? Those are your choices. In terms of dairy, he was pretty fixated on this Class 7 ultra-filtered milk powder issue, which is a real issue, and the United States basically got what it wanted on that. Now, what the United States did not get is a complete dismantling of supply management. So Canada was able to preserve a lot of what it needed to preserve for its own purposes in dairy and in agriculture, and the U.S. made a little bit of progress. So I think in this one, both sides get to claim victory.
It didn't really seem like the U.S., though, had been asking for a full dismantling of supply management.
I never heard that at any point. And when we looked at the levels of market access that have been offered, there was a certain level in the Canada-EU agreement, something north of 3%, and then something more was offered in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and this is still under 5%. So it's been an incremental increase in market access, really very manageable. It should be very manageable for Canadian dairy.
Okay, we're going to see, because I'm sure there'll be some more questions on that. We're going to pause our conversation and say goodbye to those of you watching on CBC News Network. Carol McNeil will have a lot more reaction to this trade deal coming up, but we are continuing our conversation, taking your questions online, so please submit them on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We'll be back with you in just a few seconds there. Have a great night. And we are back with Mary Scott Greenwood and Laura Dawson. I'm Vashi Kapelos, and this is the Extended Power in Politics Online. I'll take another question. Let's start, Scotty, with Valerie Kathleen on Facebook. Can you talk about the intellectual data provision?
Sure. Believe it or not, I'm happy to talk about
Great.
that. The part of the modernization of this agreement is how do you deal with what's known as follow-on biologics. Biologics are the new kind of medicine that's based on human biology, not just chemistry. And so how do you deal with the data protection, the intellectual property for the people that create these life-saving measures? And what the industry, the innovative industry, wanted was 10 years of protection. Actually, they wanted 12 years, but they're getting 10 years of protection. That's a few more years than in old existing agreements. So that is a win for innovators in Canada and the United States, and it's something that will be controversial and will certainly be debated, on both sides of the border. But it's if you want to have life-saving measures, you've got to be able to create an environment where innovators come up with new products. So this is what that's about, and it's 10 years, I think, in the new agreement, and that's what Mexico agreed to, and it's a little less than the U.S. wanted, but from our perspective, it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and it's important to remember this is a particular class of drugs. These are gene therapies. They're extraordinarily...
Aren't they kind of the wave of the future, though?
They are. It's what everybody wants if they get sick, but they're extraordinarily difficult to develop. They're not the usual, what we call small molecule drugs. They are the stuff that, it takes billions of dollars to develop. It's so much more expensive and difficult to develop these kinds of drugs that the innovators want this extra level of protection. But at the same time, it's still a small segment of the market. It is probably not going to result in higher drug costs.
Well, that's the concern I want to ask you about, because there are people saying that this will mean generics, the generics don't have the access to that technology, that that knowledge base, and therefore will pay more for drugs.
Yeah, and what it actually means is 10 years of data protection. What does that mean? It means that the innovator who has done all the clinical trials and all of the testing does not have to release his results to the generic industry for 10 years. So, that seems pretty reasonable. If you've put all that investment in, you should have the benefit of, profiting from your investment, or we wouldn't have this kind of innovation.
Okay, Laura, I'll follow up. Maralina, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly. Repo on Facebook asks, is it true that the energy proportionality is no longer in NAFTA? And this is something that the Minister Freeland brought up.
That's a great question. I'm pretty sure that Maralina is right. It seems to be gone. Those of you who are historians of the NAFTA and the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement remember that there was a proportional access clause on water and energy in the original agreements, that if Canada ever shut off its taps to the U.S., that it would have to proportionately reduce its own uses as well. I have been reliably informed it's gone on both water and on energy. And in fact, there's an additional statement on water that says we are not in the business of trading water, and this agreement is not intended to cover bulk water exports.
Okay, Alan Musgrave on Facebook, Scotty asks, will the increase in this is a question about the technical aspects of de minimis, but I'll also get you to weigh in on it more broadly. Will the increase in the de minimis threshold apply to only online sales or all sales, including cross-border shopping?
Great question. So it's online sales, and it's not clear how the tax part of that provision goes. I think there's some more work to be done there. I know that there are a number of everybody on this one is kind of mad. Nobody is really happy or completely happy, I should say, with the outcome. Although it's a step in the right direction to raise the threshold. But it's for online shopping. If you travel across the border, your de minimis level, you can buy $200 a day worth of goods before you get charged tariffs. When you shop online now, it's 150, I think, for the new agreement. So this is just online. Okay, and
Todd Callicott on YouTube asks, all feelings aside for Trudeau and the trade minister, was this a good deal? Laura, I'll throw that one at you first.
Yeah, it was the best available deal under the circumstances. I think, the Canadian negotiators were sitting there with that old Clash song, should I stay or should I go now? And I think they held on as long as they could, got enough technical elements of the deal done, got down to making real trade-offs and real concessions. And, the old negotiators say the best deal is where everybody walks away feeling a little bit slighted.
Scotty, what do you think? And I wonder, we had this discussion among a number of our panels tonight, but how much the context, and I mean context always matters, but the sort of worst case scenario, the mother lode as we were being threatened with last week, impacted the end evaluation of who walked away a winner and a loser?
Yeah. Right. Well, I don't doubt that the President of the United States would pull a crazy Ivan and would do something that's not in his own interest economically just to try to win a fight. That's not beyond President Trump. But what I think is really commendable is that at the end of the day, the Trudeau government didn't take the bait, right? Because the president was using really, and meanwhile also neither did the Mexicans when there was all of this harsh incendiary rhetoric being used about Mexico, and then it was being used about Canada, and you could have sort of said, look, we're not going to cave to the bully. That's not what this is about. And you could have just decided to have a fight with the president and not save the economy. But instead, Canada kept cool. Mexico did too, and said, we're just going to get a better deal. And I was surprised by how much Canada got. I don't know about Laura, but I was surprised that Canada was able to hang on to Chapter 19, the dispute resolution mechanism. I thought for sure that would be something that Lighthizer would flip the table over. And Canada actually won the day on that one. So, I'm really happy and surprised, and Canada and Mexico kept cool in the face of a really challenging and kind of all over the place partner in the United States.
Yeah, I think Chapter 19 was the biggest surprise to me too. I was pretty sure Canada was going to have to walk that back, come up with a less satisfactory mechanism, and the fact that they got Chapter 19, got status quo on most of the other contentious issues, that's a win.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of questions on all platforms about hormones in U.S. dairy. And can either of you guys address whether if there will be any change in regulations or how that might impact? I mean, a lot of people who are concerned that the labeling is different and that kind of thing.
Well, now we're getting into the stump the band question, and this is why I'm glad that somebody really smart like Laura Dawson is on this panel, because the only thing I know about hormone and dairies is what I know from my good friends at Ben & Jerry's, and they use no growth hormones in their ice cream. But honestly, I don't know what's in this deal, and I'm hoping Laura can help me out.
I don't think it's what's in the deal that's necessarily important, because we already have a very strong regime with the United States and what they call sanitary and phytosanitary measures that has to do with labeling, that has to do with what is permissible on either side of the border. It is still, whether it is hormones or additives or pornography, it is still not permissible to import something that is illegal in your own territory. Now, I know Canada and the U.S. have been working together for years on alignment and recognition on their dairy regime. So there'll be nothing in this agreement on dairy or anything else that says, Canada, you must buy something that is prohibited currently in your regime.
Scotty Japlica Talik on Facebook asks, is this a lesson for Canada in that we should start trading with other countries so that not all of our exports go to the U.S.?
Well, that's a decision for Canada to make, although Laura rightly pointed out earlier that the United States is the easiest, biggest market. So I think trade diversification is a great idea. The fact is that you live next to a relatively well-to-do country that wants to consume everything you can possibly make or grow, and that's a benefit. So I think the better way to look at this is, let's have some rules of the road. Let's have a fair, agreed upon way to fight it out when we need to fight it out, but let's have a path forward. The other thing I would just say is, it sounds a little bit trite, but I think Canada, the United States, and Mexico, our North American neighborhood, is better together. I would much rather have all of us kind of arm in arm dealing with the many challenges that we face as a neighborhood versus the rest of the world than trying to look back and forth to each other. But I mean, I understand the instinct and I understand the desire to not be so reliant on the United States, because every once in a while we elect, a set of leaders that makes it really hard to do business with us. I get it.
Laura, can I ask you about actually a part of the deal that has to do with this, and that's China?
Uh-huh.
And what was agreed? Can you sort of explain this? Is it significant? It sounds significant on the face of it for me, but I'm not the expert on what we agreed to as far as the potential for an FTA with China and the kind of notice that we have to give the U.S. now.
Yeah, we're all going to have to look at that much more carefully, because on the face of it, it looks like, hey, if you're planning on doing a deal with a non-market economy or economy that we object to, that we can talk about suspending your benefits under this agreement. So that has the potential to be very serious.
Is that new? Like, have you seen that in other agreements?
No, that's kind of innovative. At the same time, the practicality of it is Canada's been dancing around a deal with China for the last 4 or 5 years, and has just found that in terms of market size and negotiating capacity, it just has been a non-starter. In my opinion, if Canada is going to do any kind of a deal with China, it's got to be in tandem with the United States and in tandem with the North America partners, because only then do you get the kind of market power you need. So Canada doing an end run around the U.S. on China doesn't make sense anyway. I think this is the commitment that they could make without any real danger of actual, punitive.
Is there any way, though, given, Scotty, and I'll end on this, the rhetoric from the president towards China, and just actually what we've heard at today's press conference, the last one he gave last week, that Canada would ever be on the exact same page when it comes to free trade with China?
That Canada would be on the same page
as the U.S.
with the U.S.?
Yeah.
I mean, it's conceivable that Canada and the United States could be on the same page. China has a lot of practices that we here in the West really object to. So I think it's conceivable that Canada and the United States could be on the same page. I really wish that the U.S. were part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because after all, that would have been a really good, effective block and a counterweight to China, which, as Laura quite rightly says, is really needed. So we'll see how it plays out. China is a whole different kettle of fish, as they say, and we are going to have to work together on all kinds of issues, we, Canada, the United States, in issues like cybersecurity and other kinds of security. So I think we ultimately will get to be on the same page if we're not today.
Okay, that wraps up our extended social media edition of Power and Politics. Thank you for all your smart questions on the new trade deal, and thank you especially to Mary Scott Greenwood and Laura Dawson for helping us understand the deal. I'm Vashi Capellas. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Vashi. Thanks,
Laura.
guys.
Thanks, Scotty.
Bye.
Bye.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Great.
There has been a lot of debate over whether this new agreement is really NAFTA 2.0 or if it's more like NAFTA 1.5, that there are some notable differences between the new deal and the current one. How significant they are depends on which side of the aisle you sit on. But let's start here with autos. The USMCA ups the amount of local content in autos from 62.5% to 75% to allow cars to move freely across borders. It also requires that a percentage of factories pay workers at least $16 an hour. Those are both changes from NAFTA. The U.S. also won more market access for dairy in this deal. Roughly 3.5% of Canada's market is now open to U.S. dairy farmers. Canada has also removed barriers to trade on milk products. That includes cheese, yogurt, and ice cream, those products that President Trump mentioned in his speech just a little while ago. Now, one of the main goals for renegotiating NAFTA was to create a more modern agreement. The current deal took effect about 25 years ago, before the advent of the digital economy. Now, there's a framework for dealing with intellectual property. Pharmaceutical companies will also get exclusive marketing rights on biologic drugs for 10 years. And it also bans duties on ebooks, music videos, and software. Now, one other change the U.S. insisted on was that this deal comes up for review every 6 years and sunsets in 16 years. Guys, the idea is to prevent this agreement from becoming outdated as well. They don't want another old NAFTA.
So a quick question about one of the sticking points in this deal, which was dairy. And the president has made a big point that some of the tariffs on U.S. dairy goods were 290% or something like that. What happened to those tariffs in this deal if only 3.5% of the Canadian agriculture market is open now to U.S. trade?
Well, it means they go away in a limited fashion. A lot of what the president was referring to was tariffs on what are known as ultra-filtered milk products. Again, he shorthanded it by calling it ice cream, cheese, yogurt, etc. U.S. producers have been very concerned that they did not have as much access to the Canadian market as they would like for those products. So that was a main point of contention, and that's where you heard a lot of anger from, let's say, dairy farmers in Wisconsin.
And now they will have that access.
Now they will have that access under the new USMCA.
All right.
From the president's point of view, he said this is a great deal for Canada, for the United States, and for Mexico. Give us a sense of how great a deal is it for the United States. How do you quantify it?
Well, it's going to be tens and tens of billions of dollars of more manufacturing and farm sales for United States companies. The reason that it's going to work, and the reason it works for all three, is we're not compromising Canada and Mexico. We're dealing with our imperfections in NAFTA that let a lot of material come in from outside. That door is now being closed. That's because of the 75% domestic requirement within the new USMCA. Further, there's a subset of 40 to 45% that has to be made at wages more than $16 an hour. That's put in there to assure that there'll be a fair distribution of the business we bring back from Asia and from Europe. As to the agriculture, been huge improvements made in that. In the case of Mexico, it isn't even just milk and dairy. We did get rid of those horrible, infamous Chapters 6 and 7, but it's also opened up poultry, eggs, cheeses, milk, all kinds of products, and elsewhere in agriculture, got rid of a very unfair classification system that put our wheat into an inferior category as it was entering Canada. Those are all gone. Plus, there's now tremendous protection for biologics. That's a very, very important thing, and it will address the costs of doing business. These are very, very huge features. Another set of features that will be very, very good is both Canada and Mexico had very low so-called de minimis rules, namely how much material you could bring in without tariff. Those are now much higher, and that's going to be very good for our e-commerce companies, and it will be very good for retailers in American communities along the respective borders of Canada and Mexico.
Right. So I know, Mr. Secretary, that there's a large team of people who have been working really, really hard, the staff, to really support the negotiation from Mr. Lighthizer and others. Give us a sense, round numbers, general, how many jobs, auto jobs, will be added because of this? The president said there's going to be a lot more jobs for auto workers. How many?
Well, we've lost a 250,000 jobs or more in the auto parts sector. You're going to see vast majority of those coming back.
So the vast majority of 250,000, similarly with respect to agriculture, farmers, what sorts of numbers are we talking about for farming here in the United States in terms of jobs?
Well, the rules there are so recent and so complicated, we frankly haven't had a chance to quantify them. But directionally, dairy, both the powdered milk and regular milk, poultry, eggs, cheese, and wheat are all very important items with Canada because they had been very bad on them. Mexico, no tariffs whatsoever on our agricultural products, and they are revising more favorably to us their so-called sanitary and phytosanitary rules, which had no scientific basis, but were really just protectionism. So in both borders, it's very good, both for automobiles and for farmers.
For Bloomberg Television and Radio, we're speaking with U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. So Secretary Ross, the president spoke repeatedly in his remarks about the problem with the balance of trade deficit. What will be the net effect on the trade deficit for the United States with Mexico and with Canada because of this new agreement?
Oh, in my estimation, it will be number of tens of billions of dollars.
But no more precise estimate than that, just tens of billions.
Look, this deal was made at midnight last night. You can't really expect us 12 hours later to have everything quantified. We will be quantifying and we will release the numbers, and you'll be astonished at how big they are.
Terrific. We'll look forward to that. Thank you, sir. So how critical is the deadline of November 30? I know that we're going to have a change in administration down in Mexico. Do we need to get this thing done before that change?
Well, that's the general understanding that we've had with the incoming President Labrador in Mexico. He wants it to be through the Mexican Congress before his inauguration on December 1st. And that's important to him for lots and lots of reasons. He's been very cooperative and very constructive in the negotiations because he knows it's good for the Mexicans. There's been almost no capital expenditure, especially foreign direct investment, in Mexico while this has been pending. This will now clear the air. And in addition, they've been in great uncertainty as to what will be the rules of trade going forward. Businesses can live with good news. Businesses can live with bad news. Very hard for business to deal with uncertainty.
Which is what we have right now with respect to China. Final question, really. What effect, if any, does this have on the Chinese negotiations or the lack of negotiations? President Trump referred to that and seemed to suggest what you've suggested to us before, which is it's too soon to really deal with China. Is that right? And when will the time be right?
Well, I think it is too soon. It only makes sense to clean up your own neighborhood first. We're now doing that with the deal with Canada and Mexico. So that solidifies our North American base. There also is some negative implication for China in the new rules of origin because they have been shipping a lot of parts in through the Nafta regime. Because Nafta, while it nominally required 62.5% of parts to be made within Nafta, it did so on very precisely specified parts, about half of which are not even used in cars anymore. And those that have been replaced by new electronics or other technological improvements have been deemed to be of Nafta origin, even though it's perfectly obvious they weren't. So these gains are coming at the expense of non-NAFTA areas, most notably Asia and Europe.